The gavel hadn't even come down yet, and already somebody was laughing. 50 rusted-out pots for the pile. Somebody get this man a doctor. The voice belonged to Dale Kirsch, a big man in a clean flannel shirt who'd never worked a day of real farm labor in his life, but liked to stand at the front of every estate sale in the county like he owned the ground it sat on. He nudged the fellow next to him, and the laughter rippled backward through the crowd like wind through wheat. Walt Pruitt didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the auctioneer on the flatbed trailer loaded with 50 cast-iron pots and lids, blackened, rust-eaten, some of them dented so badly they'd never sit flat on a stove again. To everyone else in the crowd gathered on the Hensley place that gray October morning, it was scrap. Junk metal somebody should have hauled to the recycler years ago. Going once for $40, the auctioneer called out, scanning the crowd for another bid that wasn't coming. Anybody know going twice? 45, Walt said. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They went quiet in that particular way people go quiet when they're too stunned to keep mocking somebody, and then Dale Kirsch found his voice again. $45, Dale said loud enough for the whole yard to hear. Walt, you could buy a whole new set of pots from the Tractor Supply for less than that. You want to explain to us what you're doing? Walt was 68 years old, thin and weathered from decades outdoors. His overalls were patched at the knee, his boots were soled twice. He'd been the subject of Pine Hollow gossip for 15 years, ever since the bank took half his herd in the bad year. Ever since Ruthie died, and he stopped coming to church ever since he started showing up to auctions, buying things nobody else wanted. Broken clocks, chipped china, rusted tools nobody would touch. "Man's gone soft in the head," somebody muttered from the back, not quiet enough. Walt didn't answer any of them. He raised his hand one more time when the auctioneer called for 50, and when nobody else bid against him, because who in their right mind would? The gavel came down, and the pots were his. Sold to the gentleman in the overalls for $50. The crowd broke into open laughter, now the kind that doesn't even bother hiding itself, and Dale Kirsch clapped slow and sarcastic, like Walt had just won an award for stupidity. A couple of the younger men actually pulled out their phones to record it because in a town like Pine Hollow, watching Walt Pruitt make a fool of himself was better entertainment than anything on television. $50 for scrap metal, Dale said, shaking his head, grinning at his buddies. I'll tell you what, Walt, you keep buying junk like this, you're going to need a bigger barn just to hold all your bad decisions. Walt walked past him without a word, climbed up onto the flatbed and started checking the tie-downs on the trailer hitch like the whole crowd wasn't even there. That was the thing people in town never understood. Walt wasn't deaf to what they said, he just didn't see the use in answering. Ruthie used to say he carried an insult the way he carried a fence post, hauled it where it needed to go, and set it down without complaining about the weight. He backed his truck up to the trailer, hitched it himself with hands that didn't shake despite the cold, and before he climbed into the cab, he did something that not one person in that crowd noticed, because not one person in that crowd was actually looking at him. He was looking at the pots. I walked the length of the flatbed, once slow, running his palm along the rusted rims, lifting a lid here, tapping a knuckle against a pot. They're the way a man checks a horse's teeth before deciding what it's worth. He wasn't looking at rust. He was looking for something underneath it. When his hand found one particular pot, deep three-legged, buried near the bottom, its handle bent almost flat. Something in his face changed. A tightening around the eyes that might have been recognition or grief or both. Then he pulled his hand back, climbed into the truck, and drove away from the Hensley place without looking back at the crowd once. Nobody in Pine Hollow knew much about where the Hensley pots had come from, mostly because nobody had bothered to ask. Old Carl Hensley had died in March '91, no wife, living 2 sons who'd left for the city decades ago and only returned to clear the estate fast. The auction company listed the pots as assorted cast-iron cookware as is no warranty, lumped in with rusted plow blades priced to move because nobody expected anybody to care. But Walt cared. Walt had cared since the moment he'd walked the property 2 days before the sale, doing what he always did before an auction, looking at what other people were going to walk right past. He'd found the pots stacked in the old smokehouse behind the barn, half buried under decades of dust, and when he'd wiped his thumb across the bottom of the top one, he'd found a mark. Small, nearly worn away. A stamped symbol he hadn't seen in 40 years, not since he was a young man working summers in a foundry 3 counties over a place that had closed its doors before most people in Pine Hollow were born. He hadn't told anyone. Not the auction house, not his neighbor Frank, not even his daughter Lacey, who called every Sunday from 2 states away and worried about her father living alone in a town that had decided long ago he was a sad old joke. I hauled the trailer home in silence past the diner where he could see through the window that half the men from the auction were already retelling the story. He pulled into his own drive, backed up to the equipment shed, and started unloading the pots one at a time, carrying each like it weighed more than it did, setting each down like it might break though. Cast iron does not break easily, and Walt knew that better than anyone. By the time the sun went down, all 50 pots were lined up on the dirt floor of the shed in neat rows, and Walt Pruitt sat down on an overturned bucket in front of them and looked at them for a long time without moving. "Well, Ruthie," he said quietly to the empty shed, to nobody, to the woman who had been gone 6 years now and who he still talked to sometimes when the house got too quiet. "Looks like I finally found them." 2 days later, Frank Delgado came by to see for himself what the whole town was talking about. Frank was the closest thing Walt had to a friend left in Pine Hollow, a retired mechanic who'd known Walt since they were boys, who'd stood up with him at his wedding to Ruthie, who'd helped him bury her when the cancer finally took what it wanted. Frank didn't laugh at Walt. Frank just worried which was worse, because Walt could feel it behind every question. "Heard you bought half the junk pile at the Hensley sale," Frank said, standing in the doorway of the shed with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the rows of blackened pots, like he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be seeing. "I bought 50 pots, Walt said. "Wasn't half the junk pile, wasn't even a third of it. Dale Kirsch is telling everybody at the diner you paid $50 for scrap iron. Dale Kirsch doesn't know what he's looking at." Frank stepped further into the shed, crouched down, picked up one of the smaller pots, turned it over in his hands. He wasn't a stupid man. 30 years fixing engines teaches a person to look past the surface of a thing, but even he could see only rust pitting decades of neglect. "All right," Frank said slowly. "So what am I looking at?" Walt took the pot from him gently, almost reverently, and turned it so the bottom caught the light from the open shed door. He pointed to a mark stamped into the iron, so faint Frank had to lean in close to make it out at all. A small circle with a stylized letter inside it. An old foundries maker's mark, the kind of detail that only meant something to a man who'd spent a summer of his youth pouring molten iron into sand molds under a roof that leaked when it rained. "Cassidy Iron Works," Walt said. "Closed in 1974. Burned to the ground the year after nobody ever proved how it started. Before that, for 11 years, they made the finest cast iron cookware east of the Mississippi. Hand-poured, hand-finished. My daddy used to say a Cassidy pot would outlast the family that owned it. And you think this is one of those?" "I know it is." Walt set the pot down carefully among its neighbors. "I worked there one summer, Frank, when I was 17. Before you knew me. Before my daddy lost the farm the first time, and we had to move. I poured iron into molds 12 hours a day for 4 months, and I'd know that mark blindfolded." Frank looked at the rows of pots again, really looked this time, and something in his expression shifted from doubt towards something more careful. "How many of these you figure are the real thing?" "Don't know yet. Some might just be regular pots that got stored with the good ones. But if even half of what's sitting in this shed came out of that foundry?" Walt stopped himself, shook his head slowly. "Collectors pay serious money for Cassidy pieces, Frank. Serious money. There's people out there who drive across 3 states for a single skillet with that mark on the bottom if it's in good enough shape to prove what it is." Frank was quiet a moment, reconciling what he was hearing with what he'd watched happen at that auction, the laughing, the phones recording Walt's humiliation. "Does Carl's boys know what their daddy had sitting in that smokehouse?" "Doubt it," Walt said. "Doubt Carl even knew what he had, not really. Or maybe he did and just never had the money or the eye to do anything about it. Either way, it went up for auction listed as scrap, and nobody bid against me because nobody looked twice. Except you. Except me." Walt picked up the deep 3-legged pot from near the end of the row, the one with the bent handle, the one he'd lingered over back at the Hensley place, and held it in both hands like it was something fragile, though it was the least fragile thing in the shed. "This one's the one that matters most," he said, quiet enough that Frank had to lean in to hear him. "How come?" Walt didn't answer right away. He set the pot back down, and for a moment, his jaw worked like he was chewing on something he didn't want to say out loud. Not even to Frank, not even after all these years. "Long story," Walt said finally. "I'll tell you when I know for certain." Frank didn't push. That wasn't how their friendship worked. He just nodded, straightened up, and looked out the shed door toward the darkening field where Walt's cattle stood scattered against the tree line, indifferent to what Walt did with 50 rusted pots. "Well," Frank said, "for what it's worth, I hope you're right. Lord knows this town could use a reason to feel foolish for once instead of you." The story didn't die down the way most Pine Hollow gossip did after a week. If anything, it grew, Somebody posted the auction video to the town's Facebook page. Dale Kirsch, laughing Walt's weathered face, not reacting at all. And by Sunday, it had more comments than anything posted in that group all year. "Poor old man's finally lost it," one comment read. "Somebody needs to check on him. This isn't normal behavior. I remember when Ruthie died. He hasn't been right since." Lacey called that Sunday evening like always, and Walt could hear the careful, measured tone in her voice before she got to the point. A daughter trying to sound casual about something she'd rehearsed since her cousin sent her the video. "Dad," she said, "somebody sent me a video from the auction." Walt sat down heavily in the kitchen chair that used to be Ruthie's, the one with the cracked vinyl seat he'd never gotten around to replacing, because replacing it felt like erasing something. "I figured somebody would. $50 for a pile of rusted pots, Dad. People are saying, they're saying some pretty ugly things in the comments." "I don't much care what people are saying in the comments." "I care," Lacey said, her voice cracking slightly, and Walt closed his eyes because that crack was the sound of a daughter 300 miles away who couldn't protect her father from a town that found him easier to laugh at than to understand. "I worry about you out there alone, and I can't just drive over and check on you the way I used to." "I'm doing fine, Lace." Walt looked through the kitchen window toward the equipment shed, dark now except for a thin line of light under the door where he'd left a lamp burning. "Better than fine, actually. Give me some time and I'll explain the whole thing. I promise you it'll make sense." "Dad, you remember your mother's stories about the summer I worked the foundry, before we were married, before I had the farm?" Lacey was quiet for a second, thrown off by the turn in the conversation. "A little. She used to say you came home every night black with soot and wouldn't talk about it." "There's a reason I wouldn't talk about it," Walt said. "And there's a reason I bought those pots. I'm not going to explain it over the phone because you'll think I've lost my mind, same as everybody else in this town already does. But I need you to trust me a little longer. Can you do that?" There was a long pause, long enough that Walt wondered if the call had dropped. Then Lacey exhaled, and he could picture her exactly rubbing the bridge of her nose, the way her mother used to when deciding whether to keep arguing or let something go. "I trust you," she said finally. "I just don't want to lose you the way we lost Mom, thinking you were fine when you weren't." "I'm not going anywhere," Walt said, and he meant it more than she probably realized. "Not till I finish what I started." He started the cleaning the next morning before sunrise, before the frost had even burned off the grass outside the shed door. It was slow work. Cast iron that sat neglected for decades doesn't give up its rust easily, and Walt wasn't about to rush it. Not with a wire brush that might scratch too deep, not with any chemical stripper that could eat into the metal. He did it the old way, the way his own father had taught him to care for the one good skillet the family owned when Walt was a boy. Salt and oil. Steel wool, slow circular motions. Hours of scrubbing that left his hands raw by the time the light faded each evening. Pot by pot, the black crust of rust and age came away, and pot by pot, the marks began to reveal themselves. Not every pot bore the Cassidy stamp. Some were ordinary pieces probably picked up over the years and stored alongside the good ones. But more than half, 29 by Walt's count, carried that small circular mark, worn but unmistakable once the rust was gone. He kept a notebook on the workbench, the kind he used to track calving records, and in it he logged every pot-size condition, whether the mark was clear or faint. It was methodical work that gave his hands something to do while his mind went somewhere else entirely, back 40 years to a foundry floor and a girl who used to bring him water at noon because the foreman never gave the young men a proper break. The three-legged pot with the bent handle sat apart from the others on his workbench, untouched for the first several days because Walt wasn't ready yet. He'd cleaned 49 pots before he finally picked it up on a cold evening in late October, sat down under the bare bulb hanging from the shed rafter, and began to work the rust away with hands that for the first time in this whole process were not entirely steady. It took him nearly 3 hours. When he finally wiped the last of the grime from the underside of the pot and held it up to the light, he found what he'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Not just the Cassidy mark, but beneath it, scratched into the iron by hand rather than stamped by machine, 3 letters and a number. RM61. Walt sat very still for a long moment, the pot heavy in his lap, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick in a way it hadn't been in years. "There you are," he said. "I've been looking for you a long, long time." I didn't tell Frank about that pot the next time his friend came by. He didn't tell Lacey on the following Sunday's call either, though she noticed something different in his voice, something softer, and asked if he was all right. "Better than all right," Walt told her. "I'll explain everything soon, I promise." What he didn't say, what he wasn't ready to say to anyone yet, was that the initials scratched into that pot belonged to a woman named Rose Merritt, who had worked the front office at Cassidy Ironworks the summer Walt was 17, who used to bring him a mason jar of water at noon because the foreman never gave the young men a proper break, and who Walt had loved with the whole clumsy weight of a boy's first heart before life and distance, and his father's failing farm pulled him away from that foundry town for good. Rose Merritt had married another man 3 years later. Walt had heard about it secondhand, and he'd gone on to marry Ruthie and build a life he never once regretted. But he had never forgotten the pot Rose had shown him once laughing, telling him she'd scratched her initials into a discard piece as a joke, a small rebellion against a job that gave her nothing else to claim as her own. He had thought that pot was lost to time. He had never expected to find it 50 years later sitting in a dead man's smokehouse, waiting on a flatbed trailer at an auction where a crowd who knew nothing about his life had laughed at him for wanting it. Now it sat in his lap, clean and gleaming under a bare shed bulb, and Walt Pruitt understood with the particular clarity that comes late in a man's life that some of the things people mock you for chasing are worth chasing precisely because nobody else can see what they're worth. He set the pot carefully on the shelf above his workbench, apart from all the others, and turned off the light. Word travels strangely in a small town. It doesn't move in straight lines so much as it seeps sideways and backward through diners and church parking lots, and the kind of phone calls that start with, "Did you hear?" and end 40 minutes later having covered 6 unrelated subjects along the way. So it was that 3 weeks after the auction, a stranger's truck pulled into Walt Pruitt's gravel drive on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and the man who climbed out of it was not from Pine Hollow at all. His name was Elliot Vance, and he introduced himself with a business card reading Vance and Holloway Antique Appraisals. A customer had shared a photograph from the local Facebook group, laughing about a farmer who'd wasted $50 on rusted junk, and something about the shape of one pot near the bottom of that trailer had made Elliot's pulse jump in a way it hadn't in years. "I specialize in early American cast iron," Elliot explained, coat still on, clearly trying and failing not to look too eager. "Foundry pieces mostly pre-1940. There are maybe a dozen serious collectors in this country who drive a long way for confirmed Cassidy pieces. The fire destroyed most of their records, and surviving pieces with clear provenance are close to unheard of on the open market. I had to see this for myself." Walt led him out to the shed without a word and watched Elliot's face as he stepped inside and saw the rows of clean, gleaming pots on shelves Walt had built himself, each labeled in careful handwriting in the notebook on the workbench. Elliot Vance stood very still in the doorway for a long moment. "Mr. Pruitt," he said quietly, "may I?" "Go ahead." What followed took the better part of 3 hours. Elliot examined each pot individually, turning it in gloved hands under a jeweler's loupe. He'd brought from his truck, murmuring measurements to himself, photographing marks and dimensions, occasionally letting out a low whistle that he seemed embarrassed to have made. Walt watched from the workbench, arms crossed, saying little, letting the man do his work. 29 confirmed Cassidy pieces," Elliot said, finally setting down the last pot with the reverence of a man handling something considerably more valuable than iron. 29, Mr. Pruitt, in documented, verifiable, largely original condition. Do you understand what that means? Tell me. It means you're sitting on what is very likely the largest known surviving collection of Cassidy Iron Works cookware in existence. There are museums that would want to speak with you. There are private collectors who would pay 5 figures for the rarest individual pieces alone. The deep camp pots, the ones with the maker's marks still legible, especially any with unique provenance markings. He paused, glanced toward the shelf where the 3-legged pot sat apart from the others, the one Walt hadn't let him examine yet. "That one," Elliot said. "You've kept it separate. May I ask why?" Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he walked over, lifted the pot down carefully, and turned it so Elliot could see the scratched initials on the underside. "That one's not for sale," Walt said. "Not now, not ever. But you can look at it if you want to understand what you're dealing with." Elliot examined it in silence, and when he finally looked up, there was something almost solemn in his expression. "Hand-scratched personal mark foundry floor, dated 1961. Mr. Pruitt, this piece alone with a story behind it, with provenance like this, collectors don't just buy pieces like this. They compete for them. This could be the centerpiece of the entire collection. It's not going anywhere," Walt said again, quieter this time, and something in his voice made Elliot Vance decide not to press the question of why. Elliot left that evening with an offer to represent the collection for sale. A conservative estimate, he said, would place the value of the 29 confirmed Cassidy pieces somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000, with the possibility of considerably more, depending on collector interest, And that figure didn't include whatever a piece with documented personal provenance, like the three-legged pot, might command in a private sale. Walt sat alone in his kitchen for a long time after Elliot's truck pulled out of the drive, the number rattling around in his head in a way that felt almost unreal. $60,000 to $90,000. More than he'd made off the farm in the last 4 years combined. More money than the whole town of Pine Hollow probably thought Walt Pruitt had ever seen at one time in his entire life. I didn't call anyone that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, looking at the empty chair across from him where Ruthie used to sit, and he thought about all the years the two of them had scraped by on a farm that never quite gave them enough, all the winters they'd gone without. So Lacey could have new boots for school, all the times Ruthie had stood in that same doorway, and told him gently that pride wasn't worth much if it kept a man from admitting when he was struggling. "You'd get a kick out of this, Ruthie," he said to the empty kitchen. "All those years, everybody in this town thought I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and here I am about to prove them wrong with a truckload of pots. They laughed me out of the auction yard for buying." But even as he said it, he knew the money wasn't really the point, and he suspected Ruthie, if she were sitting across from him right now, would have known that too. The point had never been proving Dale Kirsch wrong, though there was a certain satisfaction in the idea of it. The point was, Rose Merritt's initials scratched into a piece of iron 50 years ago, and a summer Walt had never fully let go of, and a promise he'd made himself a long time back that he could never quite explain to anyone. Not even Ruthie, though he suspected she'd understood more of it than she ever let on. The news broke wide open in Pine Hollow the following week, and it broke the way these things always seem to in a town this size. Not through Walt himself, who told almost no one, but through Elliot Vance, who mentioned the collection to a fellow appraiser at a regional antiques show, who mentioned it to a reporter from the county paper doing a slow week's worth of local color, who called Walt directly and asked if he could come out and take some photographs for a feature story. Walt almost said no. In the end, he said yes, mostly because Frank convinced him it was the only way to make sure the story got told straight, instead of getting twisted sideways through gossip, the way everything else about him had for the past 15 years. The article ran on a Thursday above the fold with a photograph of Walt standing in his shed among the cleaned and gleaming pots, his weathered face unsmiling but not unkind. The headline reading, "Local farmer's junk purchase may be rare. Historic collection worth 6 figures." By Friday morning, half of Pine Hollow had read it, and the tone of the town's whispering changed almost overnight from mockery to something closer to disbelief, and then in some quarters to something uglier than either. Dale Kirsch showed up at Walt's farm on Saturday afternoon, driving a truck considerably newer and cleaner than Walt's own, and he didn't bother knocking before he called out from the drive. "Walt, you home?" Walt came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, and regarded Dale with the same flat expression he'd worn at the auction weeks before. "Dale, heard about the article." Dale's grin was too wide, too eager, the grin of a man trying to recast himself as a friend after weeks of being the loudest voice in the crowd, laughing at Walt's expense. "Hell of a thing, Walt. Hell of a thing. I always said you had a good eye. Didn't I always say that? Don't recall you saying much of anything, except that I'd gone soft in the head." Dale's grin faltered just slightly before he pushed forward anyway, the way men like Dale Kirsch always did when they wanted something badly enough. "Look, I know things got a little heated at the auction. Boys were just having a bit of fun, nothing meant by it. Fact is, I came by because I got some cash saved up, and I got a real appreciation for history, and I thought maybe you and I could work something out on a couple pieces before you sell the whole lot off to some big city collector. Is that right? I'm talking fair market, Walt. I'm not trying to lowball you. Just thought, seeing as we're neighbors, we ought to look out for each other." Walt looked at him for a long moment, and something in his silence made Dale shift his weight from one foot to the other, the confidence starting to drain out of his posture, the way it drains out of a man who's beginning to suspect the ground under him isn't as solid as he thought. "Dale," Walt said finally, "you stood in that crowd 3 weeks ago and told the whole yard I was too stupid to know the difference between an investment and a pile of scrap. Recorded it on your phone near as I remember so everybody who wasn't there could enjoy the joke too. That was just, Walt, come on, that was just talk. And now you're standing in my driveway asking me to sell you a piece of history at a friendly discount because we're neighbors." Walt shook his head slowly. "I've lived next to plenty of neighbors in my life, Dale. Never had one laugh in my face and then come asking for a favor 2 weeks later. That's not neighborliness. That's just greed wearing a different coat." Dale's jaw tightened. "So that's a no." "That's a no." Dale stood there a moment longer, clearly searching for something to say that might salvage the visit, and finding nothing. He turned and walked back to his truck, muttering something under his breath that Walt didn't bother straining to hear. He wasn't the last one to try either. Over the following 2 weeks, no fewer than 6 people from Pine Hollow found reasons to stop by the farm. Some with cash offers, some with vague talk of partnership. One particularly bold soul who suggested Walt owed it to the community to sell locally rather than to some outside collector, and Walt turned every one of them away with the same quiet, unhurried patience. It wasn't anger that drove him. Frank noticed that watching his old friend field these visits with something closer to weariness than resentment. "Doesn't seem to bother you much," Frank observed one evening, sitting on Walt's porch with a beer in hand while Walt worked oil into the surface of a newly cleaned pot on the step beside him. "Used to bother me," Walt admitted. 15 years of this town treating me like the village fool, and then 2 seconds after I turn out to be right about something, half of them show up wanting a piece of it. Would have made me plenty angry once. What changed? Walt looked out toward the dark tree line at the edge of his property where the cattle had settled in for the night and was quiet long enough that Frank wondered if he'd answer at all. "I stopped needing them to be sorry," Walt said finally. "That's what changed. I spent a long time wanting this town to take back what they said about me, after Ruthie died wanting somebody to admit they'd been wrong. But somewhere along the way, working on these pots every night, I figured out that's not really what I want anymore. I don't need Dale Kirsch's apology. I don't need this whole town to change its mind about me. I just need to finish what I started." "And what exactly did you start, Walt?" Frank asked, setting his beer down, looking at his old friend with the directness of a man who'd earned the right to ask. "You've been dodging that question for a month now. What's this really about?" Walt set down the pot. He'd been working, wiped his hands slowly on the rag beside him, and for the first time in weeks, he told somebody the whole truth. He told Frank about the summer at Cassidy Ironworks, about a girl named Rose Merritt, who used to bring him water at noon, about the pot she'd scratched her initials into as a joke, and shown him laughing behind the foundry building, about how his family's farm had failed that same autumn, and he'd had to leave before anything between them had a chance to become what it might have become. He told Frank about hearing years later that Rose had married another man, moved away, and about how he himself had gone on to build a good life with Ruthie, a life he loved completely and never once regretted. But he told Frank, too, about the particular ache of finding that pot again 50 years later, not because he wanted Rose Merritt back, not because his marriage to Ruthie had been anything less than everything, but because that pot was proof that a piece of his own youth, a piece of who he'd been before life, narrowed his choices down to survival, and duty had actually existed, had been real, hadn't simply vanished the way so much of a person's early life eventually does, unremembered by anyone but the person who lived it. "I bought that whole trailer of pots for $50, Walt said quietly, "because somewhere in that pile there was a chance, just a chance, that piece of my own history was still sitting there waiting for somebody to notice it, same as I'd been waiting to be noticed for 15 years in this town. And when I found it, Frank, when I actually held that pot in my hands again after 50 years, he stopped, cleared his throat, looked away toward the dark field. It felt like proof that a man's whole life doesn't have to disappear just because everybody around him has stopped paying attention." Frank didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he reached over and put a hand on Walt's shoulder, the way he had at Ruthie's funeral 6 years earlier, and left it there. "Well," Frank said, finally, his voice a little rougher than usual, "I'd say that's worth a lot more than $50. The sale of the Cassidy Ironworks collection, minus the 3-legged pot Walt had made clear from the beginning was never going anywhere, took place in early December, arranged privately through Elliott Vance's connections, rather than at public auction, which suited Walt just fine. He had no interest in turning his own private history into another spectacle for Pine Hollow to gather around and gawk at. The final figure, once all 29 pieces had sold to a combination of private collectors and one small regional museum that acquired 4 pieces for a permanent exhibit on early American foundry work, came to just over $94,000. Walt didn't tell anyone the exact number, not even Frank, though. Word inevitably got around that it was substantial. What he did instead in the weeks that followed was quietly deliberate about where that money would go, and the choices he made surprised even the people who thought they knew him. He paid off the remaining balance on his farm loan first, the debt that had hung over him since the bad year, the one that had started half the whispering about him in the first place. Then he set aside a portion for Lacey, not as a handout, but as a fund toward the down payment on the house, she and her husband had been saving for and struggling to afford. And then with what remained, Walt Pruitt did something that nobody in Pine Hollow expected from a man they'd spent 15 years dismissing as bitter and broken. I went to see the Hensley boys, Carl's two sons, who'd sold off their father's estate as quickly as they could and moved on with barely a second thought. And he told them the truth about what had been sitting in their father's smokehouse all those years, and he handed each of them a check for $8,000. "You didn't have to do that," the older son said, standing in Walt's driveway staring at the check like he wasn't sure it was real. "We sold it to you fair and square. Whatever it turned out to be worth after the fact, that's yours." "I know I didn't have to," Walt said, "but your daddy kept that iron in good enough shape for 50 years that it was still worth something when I found it. Man deserves some credit for that, even if he's not around to collect it himself. Figured his boys ought to have a piece of what he left behind, even if none of us knew what it really was at the time." I gave money too to the volunteer fire department that had once years back, when the bank was foreclosing on half his herd, shown up without being asked to help him repair a barn roof that was about to collapse under a heavy snow. A debt he'd never quite felt settled about, and now finally could. And the last piece of it, the piece that, when word of it eventually got around Pine Hollow, did more to change how the town spoke about Walt Pruitt than the sale of the pots ever had he gave to Marla Denning, a widow, 2 farms over, who'd lost her husband to a combine accident that spring and had been quietly, desperately behind on her mortgage ever since, too proud to ask anyone for help and too exhausted to hide it entirely. Marla had been one of the people standing in that crowd at the Hensley auction. She hadn't laughed loudest, but she'd laughed caught up in the moment, same as everyone else. And she'd told Walt as much, tearfully standing on her own porch when he came to deliver the envelope himself. "I laughed at you that day," she said, her voice breaking. "I laughed right along with the rest of them, and now you're standing here handing me enough to keep my house. Walt, I don't understand." "You don't have to understand it," Walt told her gently. "You just have to let me do it. This town's been hard on both of us this year, one way or another. No sense in one hard year making somebody else's harder, not when I've got the means to fix it." The change in Pine Hollow didn't happen all at once, and Walt hadn't expected it to. Small towns don't apologize in grand gestures. They apologize in small ones, in a woman at the grocery store who suddenly makes a point of asking after his health, and a neighbor who waves from the road, who never used to in the diner where the waitress starts refilling his coffee without being asked and won't let him pay for the pie anymore. Dale Kirsch never did apologize outright. Some men never quite manage that particular sentence, but he stopped showing up at Walt's farm asking for favors, and the one time their paths crossed at the feed store that winter, he nodded at Walt with something that might have been the closest thing to respect Dale Kirsch was capable of offering. Walt didn't need it. That was the thing Frank noticed most, watching his old friend move through that winter with a kind of quiet ease he hadn't carried in years. Walt wasn't waiting on the town's approval anymore. He'd stopped needing it somewhere back in October, sitting on a bucket in his equipment shed, with 50 rusted pots in front of him and a whole crowd's laughter still ringing in his ears. And he'd found something better than approval in his place. The plain, sturdy satisfaction of a man who had trusted his own judgment when nobody else would, and had been right. On a cold evening in late December, with snow falling steady outside the kitchen window, Walt sat at his table with the 3-legged pot in front of him, cleaned now to a deep seasoned black that caught the light from the overhead lamp. He'd made a decision about it finally, after weeks of turning the question over in his mind. I wasn't going to sell it, and he wasn't going to keep it locked away in a shed either. A private grief nobody else would ever see. Instead, he decided he would use it, actually cook in it, the way it was always meant to be used, the way Rose Merritt herself might have used it if her life had gone a different direction 50 years ago. Some things Walt had come to believe were meant to be lived with rather than preserved behind glass. He set the pot on the stove, added a little oil, and began browning the beginnings of a stew, the way Ruthie used to make it on cold nights, just like this one. And as the kitchen filled with the smell of it, he found himself smiling. Not the tight, guarded smile he'd worn through 15 hard years in this town, but something looser, something closer to peace. Lacey called that evening, same as always, and this time Walt told her everything. The whole story start to finish, Rose Merritt and the foundry and the pot, with the scratched initials, and all the months of quiet work that had led him here. Lacey listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Dad," she said, finally, her voice thick, "I wish Mom could have seen this." "She saw plenty in her time," Walt said, looking over at the empty chair across the kitchen table, the one he still hadn't moved. "I think she'd have liked knowing I finally found what I was looking for. even if it took me 50 years and a shed full of rusty pots to do it. Outside, the snow kept falling over Pine Hollow, over the auction yard, where a crowd had once laughed at an old farmer for seeing value. Nobody else could over a small town that was slowly, unevenly learning to look a little closer before it decided what something or someone was really worth. Walt Pruitt stirred his stew, set the table for one, and for the first time in a long while, didn't feel alone in the room at all.